Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for coming to the Optical Sciences Colloquium series. Today we have something a little bit different. We are very lucky to have with us Mary Peterson, who's a professor in the psychology department here at the university. Mary and I have collaborated a couple of times in my time here at the university on proposals in the field of image science. We have a lot of folks here in optics that work on imaging, technology to create images, and Mary works in the very complementary field of perception, and she's going to be talking today about memory and context effects on object formation. Mary got her doctorate degree from Columbia University, and she started her academic career at Stony Brook, and then she came to the University of Arizona sometime a few years ago, and she was the director of the cognitive science program here and has been at all academic levels in the Department of Psychology. She's a fellow of the Association for Psychological Sciences and Division III of the American Psychological Association. And for the folks that work in image science, I think you might find it exciting to look for opportunities to collaborate with folks in the social and behavioral sciences to understand how the users of our technology process information. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Scott. Can everybody hear me? Is this microphone working? Good. So it's hard for me to know exactly what to prepare for a colloquium to an optical sciences department. I've prepared a talk on my behavioral experiments. We also do experiments in my lab using EEG. That's measuring brain waves by putting a cap on the outside of someone's head. And we also do fMRI experiments where we see what parts of the brain are active in various tasks. But it's very difficult to talk about too many different methods in one talk. The talk can get away from you if you do that. So I've chosen to just talk about the behavioral methods today. And I want to start by saying, please stop me if you have questions of understanding. I don't want to slip into jargon. I don't want to leave my audience behind. So let me know if you have questions. Okay, now I'm going to start by doing something quite unusual. I want you to look at the screen. I'm going to show you a series of black silhouettes. They're going to be up there very briefly. They'll come up one after another. Just watch them go by. Okay, I'm going to come back to those silhouettes later on. So the talk I'm giving today is a talk about how do we organize the visual field into objects and shapes, objects at different distances. It's something that seems very easy. Seems like it happens immediately. Seems like it should be no problem at all. And that's what computer scientists thought in the 1960s when they started creating computer models. They thought they would have vision solved within 10 years. Vision is not yet solved. Vision scientists don't know how to do it. Computer scientists don't know how to do it. We're moving along there, but the problem isn't solved yet. Most object recognition models nevertheless take as a given the fact that we've already segregated out objects in the visual field. That itself is a very difficult problem. And it entails both grouping some parts of the visual field together and segregating other parts of the visual field. So just to try to give you a sense of why perceptual organization is a problem, take a look at this picture. If you haven't seen it before, there's actually a quite recognizable object in there. It's going to be hard for you to see it. But I'm showing it to you now just to give you a sense of what the visual system has to do. It has to put together all sorts of disparate activations on the retina. So light comes in to the eye. The light is absorbed by the receptors. From there on in, it's all electrical signals in the brain. There are no pictures in your head whatsoever. But what has to happen is the brain has to decide what bits and pieces go together to form an object and which bits and pieces don't go with those other bits. Can you see that there's a dog in this slide? Can you all see it by now? There's a Dalmatian in the slide. Okay. Here's another example of the difficulty of perceptual organization. It's one of my favorites. These are zebras, as you know right away, and you can distinguish where one zebra's back is and what's different between the stripe borders and the body borders on the zebra. It's actually a very, very difficult task, yet your brain solves it. I won't say it solves it readily. There's a lot of processing involved. And you may know that zebras camouflage themselves against each other. They run as a herd, and then they can't be caught by lions because the lion doesn't know where to attack on the zebra. The lion can't see one zebra from another. The lion will catch any zebra that lags behind the herd. That's the one that will lose its life. So just to give you a little bit of background, about 100 years ago, in fact it was 100 years ago, it was in 1912, the Gestalt Psychologists came into vogue in the field of perceptual psychology. They tried to account for all of object perception without using past experience at all. And they were doing this because they were reacting against a tradition that accounted for all of object perception only using past experience. And that was an untenable position. So the Gestalt psychologists came in and said, look, some processing of the visual input must precede access to object memories. Otherwise, it would be an intractable problem. If you have a bunch of dots, like the dots I showed you that cohered into a Dalmatian eventually, how would your visual system know which memories to match those dots against, the Gestalt psychologists argued, unless you had some basic organization? So what they argued is that perceptual organization comes first, and that is grouping together what goes together and segregating apart things that are different, and that means segregating objects from their backgrounds. And that's what I'm going to talk about here. So let's talk about object ground segregation. Here in this slide you see two little black objects on a larger white ground. And I imagine everybody has seen that. Nobody has seen the white side as the figure on where the white and black regions share a border. But whenever two regions in the visual field share a border, as each of these black regions do with the white regions adjacent to them, the border appears to belong to only one of those regions, and that is the region that appears to have shape. It appears to be the object. The other region, the white region in this case, appears shapeless near the border and just appears to go behind the object. And so the Gestalt psychologists said, this happens first, and this process happens the same way for both of these objects, the tree that you recognize immediately, and this novel shape that I created that maybe you'll say looks a little bit like a top, but it's a novel shape that you haven't seen before. And the Gestalt psychologist said, first we have, as humans, we have inborn cues that operate to tell us where objects are in our world. They tend to be regions that are convex, bulging outward, as opposed to concave. They tend to be symmetric around a vertical axis as opposed to asymmetric. They tend to be surrounded, and they tend to be smaller in area than surrounding or background regions. And the Gestalt psychologist said, you get the objects first, equally by these cues for both of these shapes up there, and only after you have them do you access object memories. And then, they argued, you access object memories only for the objects and not for the adjacent grounds. So this seems a logical way to go about doing visual perception. It's computationally efficient. Why bother attempting to recognize shapes or objects that might be there that ultimately the visual system determines aren't there? It's neat and straightforward. It's a serial feed-forward kind of way of thinking about how vision operates. And this is how most people like to think about vision. But it's wrong. There was actually surprisingly little evidence for it. So the evidence that was for it at the time of the Gestalt psychologists was they had many demonstrations that the cues I listed can help you find objects, but they never tested whether or not past experience with particular objects helped you as well. They also refer to this particular display, which is called the Rubin vase faces. And many of you might have seen this before in some puzzle book. If you see the black region in here as the object, then the white region appears to continue behind it, and the black region looks like a goblet or a vase. If, however, you see the white regions as figure along the borders shared with the black regions, you see two profiles of faces looking at each other, and that black region now seems shapeless. The black region seems like it's the background. So does it require this border on the outside? That's an interesting question. You're much more likely to reverse to see the faces on the outside if this boundary is there. It doesn't require it, but you're more likely to, because it's kind of more feasible that the head might be continued behind this frame. And I'm going to come back to that issue later in my talk. So there is this coupling. You know, if you see the black region as figure, you recognize the vase. If you get the white regions as figure, you recognize the faces. And people took this as evidence that you get the object form first, and then you do object recognition. But some of you may have heard the problem with this. I don't have it up there. I do. It's a coupling between two things that are happening simultaneously in your perception. It isn't that you see it reverse and then you see the other interpretation. You see the reversal into the black region as figure, and you recognize the vase simultaneously. So there's a coupling, and that is not evidence for causality. So in the 1990s, my students and I started directly testing whether or not object memories were accessed very early in the course of processing and help the visual system determine where objects lie in the visual field. I'm going to present just one of those experiments because I'd like to take you through a number of different experiments we've done, including some very recent experiments. I'll take you through one of the early experiments that we did. So we created displays like these where we have a black and white region sharing a border. The two regions are equal in area. They're equally convex. But one of them, as you can probably see, depicts a portion of a familiar, well-known object, a standing woman with her arms crossed, so you're only seeing her shoulder and her elbow. And what we did was we said, okay, you're used to seeing women standing on their feet rather than standing on their heads. And so we compared subjects' likelihood of seeing a region of a display that depicted a portion of a familiar object as figure when that object was in its typical upright orientation compared to in an atypical upside down orientation. And we did this comparison because that comparison holds constant all the features in the display. The only thing that is changing is the top-bottom relationship of those features. We tested a large number of stimuli, I think 24 in this experiment. And of course, we didn't have our critical region always in black, as you see it here. Half the time it was black, half the time it was white. Half the time it was on the left, as you see it here, half the time on the right. And we've presented a very brief exposure on the computer screen, 86 milliseconds, and then we masked it with a bunch of randomly oriented lines and splotches and dots. And we asked subjects simply press a key, left or right, tell us which side of that central border appeared to be the object in that display. Okay. So here are the data. What we found was that subjects reported seeing the critical region, black in this slide here, as figure more often upright than inverted, substantially and significantly more often upright than inverted. No cue is going to be effective 100% of the time in a brief exposure. The effectiveness of this familiarity cue is larger than that of the equivalent Gestalt cues that I told you about before. So this is a large effect. So we took the orientation dependency of our results, the fact that the orientation, upright versus inverted, of the stimulus mattered, to suggest that the familiarity of an object that might be seen on one side of a border is one more property that is considered by the brain before it decides where an object lies in the visual field. And also, we took these data to indicate that to be effective, familiarity has to be detected very, very quickly. This detection that I'm talking about is unconscious, by the way. And we know from other people's experiments that the familiarity of upside-down objects is detected at a longer latency than the familiarity of right-side-up objects. A difference of about anywhere from 100 to 500 milliseconds in some experiments. I think the 100 millisecond estimate is the one that's appropriate for my results. But the orientation dependency then told us you have to have access to those object memories quickly if they're going to exert an influence on figure ground segregation or object perception. I'll take you back to this slide for a minute. As you look at this slide, you can certainly recognize that woman standing on her head on the right side of the slide. And once you see that region as figure, you can then go about identifying it. But what I was looking at in this experiment was these quick unconscious processes that were influencing what region you saw as figure in the first place. And those are the ones that must be completed very quickly. Scott?
To identify what the figure was, or were they just...
In this experiment, we did not ask them to identify what the figure was. We just had them pressing the keys. After the experiment, after they had been through 24 of them, we would say, did you recognize any of them? But that becomes a memory test and not an online test.
So they may have access to memory, but not even necessarily recognize what it is they're looking at.
Oh, yeah. In fact, this was an 86 millisecond exposure. In another experiment, we found we could see effects of past experience in an exposure as brief as 28 milliseconds that was masked immediately. And there, when we asked subjects afterwards if they recognized anything, they said, no. And then as we increase the exposure duration, they're more likely to remember having recognized something. But yet we can see those influences in very brief exposures. And we even can see them operating unconsciously. I'll show you those experiments later.
The white background wasn't a figure, but in the, I don't see it, in the Rubin vase, what would people perceive if there was not a background but just an outline? The vase, would they see two different figures or
well,
like a black line instead of a ground and an object?
Okay, so for the Rubin, are you asking about that rectangular frame around the outside, or are you asking me if it weren't filled in black and white, if it were just an outline drawing?
Right, if we're an outline.
If we're an outline drawing.
Went to the edge of the box. Would people see?
You know, people still see it, but you know, the Rubin vase spaces is very interesting because there have not been systematic experiments done with it of the sort that it would be interesting to do. Another reason it's very interesting to me is that Rubin was one of the earliest Gestalt psychologists. He published his monograph in 1915. And nonetheless, people thought that past experience doesn't influence figure ground perception. Yet, if I were to take a novel shape in the middle that didn't have anything familiar on the outside at all, you wouldn't be reversing that stimulus at all. You'd have a heck of a time doing it. And subjects can really reverse that Rubin vase spaces pretty easily. I think the local circumstances will matter a good deal, you know, how believable it is that there might be a full head hidden behind a frame. But the experiments that have looked at outline drawings find an outline drawing works just as well as black, you know, fill and white filled area. Symmetry is important because that's one of the cues helping the inside be seen as figure. And I'm going to come back to that later, too, because I'm going to use that to compete against familiarity in some of my experiments. So did you have trouble seeing some of the things I was talking about here? No? Okay. All right, so based on this experiment, and actually many, many others, my colleagues and I proposed a new view of object perception. So rather than this sequential view that says, well, first you do object perception, then later on you access object memories, we propose that there is a fast passive processing that goes up to the highest levels of the brain, identifying the properties that are object properties on both sides of borders in the visual field. So borders are detected early. So we'll give the Gestalt psychologist that. Something must be detected before you can go on and access memories. If you've got the borders, then you can begin to access both the traditional Gestalt properties and familiarity, do a first passive processing up to the highest levels in the brain, and then have a competition between the objects that might be seen on both sides of a border. And we argue that this first passive processing is unconscious, very, very fast, and operates scene-wide, not just on single borders. So what is present across the scene is going to influence what you see at a single border. And some of the questions you were asking were getting at that. What about the rest of the scene? How is that contributing to what you see? A lot. So there's competition, and competitive mechanisms are used quite often now to understand what's going on in the brain. The models of attention are competitive mechanisms. The models of all sorts of reversals are competitive mechanisms. The winner in this case is going to be perceived as the object, and the loser is going to appear like a shapeless ground. So in other words, we don't believe there is any object-ground stage that happens early, and we believe that all of these object properties are accessed for both the region ultimately perceived as the object and the region ultimately perceived as the ground. And so we think that object perception is an outcome. It's not a stage in the process. Okay, so I want to come back to this fast initial feed-forward processing pass and ask, okay, well, how high does it go? I'm saying it goes to the highest levels of the brain. How high does it go? And so I want to show you an experiment now that we've finished just recently, asking, is the meaning of an object that might be seen in, or might be perceived in a scene, accessed as well? So, are the semantics of the competing proto-objects accessed before object formation is completed? So to address this question, we created special displays where we've engineered them so that you will not see the familiar object as figure. So you saw some of these at the beginning of the talk, and let me pause here and ask you, when you looked at those black silhouettes I flashed for you at the beginning of the talk, did any of you see familiar shapes on the outsides? Shoes? Airplanes? Anything else? Those two? But I'm glad that most of you didn't, because what I wanted to do by showing you those at the beginning was give you a sense of what subjects in my experiment might be doing. I do not give them a lecture on figure ground segregation before they are in my experiment. They see the displays for very brief exposures, shorter than you did, and they tend not to see the shapes on the outside of the displays. We have created them so that those shapes on the outside of the displays will be hidden unless you have plenty of time and you're looking for them. And so we use symmetry. The black regions are symmetric around the vertical axis. They're smaller in area. They're presented singly on a big white screen, centered on a big white screen. So they're smaller in area than the white surrounding regions. They're surrounded by those regions. Subjects are fixating right where they appear. Fixation is another cue that adds to the likelihood that something will be seen as an object. So we've made these displays very carefully to make it highly unlikely that subjects will consciously perceive the shape on the outside of the displays. And we do have post-experiment questions asking subjects whether or not they saw these shapes and really grilling them, showing them some examples to make certain they haven't seen the shapes. Because what we're interested in this experiment is what happens on the first passive processing. And we want to know what happens for the ground side of the edge, because that side of the edge is not seen as an object consciously. So therefore, if we can show that there is semantic access, for that shape that might have been seen but is rejected by the visual system, then we can be more confident that this is semantic access on the first pass of processing. If we asked a question about the region that was seen as figure, we would have no idea whether or not it was the first pass of processing or after the object had been determined. Is that clear? I'm not seeing lots of nods. Oh, yeah, that's clear. Question?
I was wondering if the figures you are showing, just like this gentleman said, if you, instead of solid black, they were just outlines. Like, for example, the first one, I feel like if it's just an outline, you probably can see their two hands easily. I guess it depends.
You know, I haven't tested it with these exact displays, but in 1994, my students and I put out a paper on those original rectangular displays that I showed where we asked, does the type of contour matter? And we had black and white solid regions, we had simple outlines, and then we had something that's called a subjective contour, where there's no contour actually present, your brain just creates the contour. We found no difference across these three kinds of contours in that experiment. Now, whether or not one would find a difference here, where we're really trying to mask the cues to help subjects see the inside as figure, I don't know, because I haven't continued to test it in every experiment I've run.
I think there is an area of actually a volume in the brain that analyzes only the contrast inside an image and then tries to process it. And this is the main reason why when we look at a cartoon, we can so easily understand or identify that character that it is representing. So it is obvious that if you see only the contrast, you get extra information, and there is a region that is really working very hard in the brain.
So contrast is certainly very important for vision. Without contrast, you cannot do figure ground segregation. In fact, you can create equiluminant displays that are red and green, but equiluminant. Usually red is a lot darker than green, so you work on them and make them equiluminant. Then you do not get figure ground segregation per se if there isn't contrast.
No, what
but
I meant is just the lines where the contrast is higher.
Yeah, but I mean, what I was going to say is that even if you have an outline border, you do have a contrast border there, and the brain is using that. So that's one reason I assume that the brain detects the edges first. I should say the borders first, because it doesn't know yet what object it's an edge for.
Contrast.
Yeah, exactly, the change of contrast. So Scott had a question, and then back there.
So I'm unable, if I look at these, to not perceive it as figure ground. So I can't perceive the white and the black as being on the same plane if I focus on the image at all.
I'm not sure. Say it again.
Like the figure ground is mandatory.
That you would see the black as figure, mandatorily.
I can make myself see the black as figure.
Uh-huh.
And the white is ground, and I can make myself see the white as figure and the black as ground. I can't make myself see them both as lying
on the same
plane.
Right, yeah. Right, because your brain is assigning the border to one side or another. So there are some circumstances under which the brain will allow you to see two sides of a border as a flat surface, and I'll talk about that a little later in my talk. But here, you've got a pretty potent cue, past experience, favoring the shape on the outside, and then you have other potent cues operating against it. They're competing, and one or the other is dominating at any given moment. And so the output for this display is, I don't want to say always, but highly, highly likely to be, I'm looking at a depiction of something that's 3D. That is, there's some object here in front of some background. Yeah, but there are other things like a striped shirt that you could look at, and you would be hard-pressed to get 3D out of that, and I'll show you an example of that later on. Yeah?
Those figures were so small on the big screen, especially for nearsighted people, that if you had shown it as the whole screen, I think people would have seen it more quickly.
Well, we don't want them to see it quickly, so that's one reason we engineered these so that subjects would only see the inside black region as figure. We were trying to keep past experience from winning the competition. And we wanted to know if past experience loses that competition and is not seen as the object, can we nevertheless find evidence that the semantics of those objects have been accessed? So let me just take you through the objects that are here in case anyone's having trouble seeing it. So here we've got portions of hands on the outside. Here below we've got a portion of an anchor. Up here, Canadian maple leaf. Down here, an umbrella. Here, an axe. And down here, a seahorse. So what we did in this experiment was we showed these displays to observers very small enough for them to see it, and of course we make certain subjects have 20/20 vision or corrected to 20/20 vision before they're in our experiments. They're sitting less than a meter away from the screen. We present the stimulus in the center of the screen, but they only get to see these silhouettes for 50 milliseconds. Excuse me?
We got about 100 when you were showing it.
Well, I tried it at 100, but you know, PowerPoint, you can tell at 100 milliseconds. I don't think it's actually giving 100 milliseconds. It's giving less than a second, but I don't know what PowerPoint's actually doing. So 50 milliseconds, very briefly. There's no doubt subjects could see them. They knew there were black silhouettes coming up on the screen. Then the silhouettes went off for a shorter period of time, 33 milliseconds. And this arrow here is indicating time. Then a word came up on the screen, centered on the same location that the silhouette had been centered on. And subject's task was classify that word as naming a natural object or an artificial object. Press one button for natural and another button for artificial. Just do it as quickly as you can. Okay? So we had three conditions. This is the same object condition. You can see the word that comes up afterwards names the object that might have been seen, but lost the competition to be seen. Here's a condition that has a different object suggested on the outside of the border, but from the same category, the large category of natural versus artificial. And here we have a different object from a different category. So artificial objects are followed by words of natural objects, naming natural objects, and vice versa. Okay, now subjects are their task has just to do with the word. Classify that as quickly as you can. Okay? So we piloted the set of words we used before we ran this experiment to make certain we had no differences in subjects' reaction times to categorize the words before they were in the experiment. And those are the data we obtained from the pilot experiment. There's no significant difference between conditions there. And now here are the data we obtained when we ran the version where the silhouettes preceded the words. And what you can see is that, start here with different object, different category condition. Those are the longest reaction times. And moreover, those reaction times are not shorter during the experimental study than during the pilot study. There's no statistical difference between those reaction times. But in both conditions where the object suggested on the ground side of the border, the silhouette, that was not perceived consciously, was from the same category as the word that came up afterwards, subjects' reaction times are statistically faster than their reaction times in the different object, different category condition. What was a little interesting to us here was that subjects were a little bit longer in the same object, well, statistically longer in the same object condition than in the different objects, same category condition. And I can tell you more about why I think we got that effect if there are questions about that later on. Yeah?
Was there any, so you have the ground that is symmetric around the center black region there. Was there any significance if the object was symmetric itself, like the leaf is symmetric itself through that middle, but the hands are not?
No, that's interesting. Yeah, but we have a fairly large set of objects for this kind of work, 40 of them. But I'd love to have a lot more to be able to ask that sort of question. So, but so far in all the experiments that we've run, there has not been a difference for these highly, highly familiar objects. We're about to do some training studies where we take originally novel objects and test them. And it would be really interesting to ask that question with those novel objects where subjects haven't got huge years and lifetimes of experience with them beforehand. Okay. So we took these data as evidence that the semantics, the meaning, the category into which the objects that might have been seen but were rejected by the visual system, the category into which they belong, or to which they belong, was accessed in that first passive processing before the brain decided where the object lay. So one might have decided it was inefficient when one was a Gestalt psychologist. Nevertheless, this is how the brain seems to do it. The brain is trying to solve the problem of where are the objects in my visual field. It has edges, it has it has borders, it has contrast differences very early in processing. But that's not enough to tell you where the shaped entity lies, where the object lies. You need more processing than that, and it seems that the brain is accessing very high levels of information to help it solve this task. Okay, so I also claimed that this process is a scene-wide process, and I want to turn now to telling you some data, about some data that gets to that question. So object ground perception is not the only solution. Scott's questions were getting at this a bit, and so was the zebra example. Sometimes when there's a border between two differently colored regions, we can interpret it just as a flat surface with stripes on it. Sometimes we can also interpret it as a junction between two planes in a geometric object. So not every border detected by the visual system is determined to be an object versus ground border. Other solutions are possible. And so I think these examples imply that spatial context is important because your resolution of this outline here as an edge of a geometric object depends upon the information around. Likewise, your resolution of the stripes versus the body edges of the zebra depends on the other information around. But the role of context has really not been pursued in this area, and we have done some investigation of that. For this investigation, we have not used the cue of familiarity. We've used one of the very strong Gestalt cues, convexity. So when the Gestalt psychologists were making their argument, they were using displays like this. And if any of you have taken an introductory psychology course, you've seen displays like this. The Gestalt psychologists showed them to observers. Again, they had black and white regions. These displays are always shown on a gray ground, so neither region contrasts more with the ground than the other, in my experiments and here also. And the Gestalt psychologists had lots of these displays. They just show them to people and say, what color region do you see as figure? How many people see the white regions as figure here? Okay, most of you. Those are the convex regions here. Those are the ones that are bulging outwards. Of course, one would want to make sure it wasn't just white versus black, so half the displays would have the convex regions black. And what the Gestalt psychologists found was that 90% of observers, or an observer on 90% of trials, is going to report seeing the convex regions as figure. So the Gestalt psychologists thought, well, that's a very, very strong cue. 90% of the time, that's enough to give you all the object structure in the world. But the Gestalt psychologists never asked whether decisions at one border were affected by what else was present in the scene. And we did. We tested 4 groups of subjects, and one of them we showed the classic 8-region displays, as I was showing you a slide before. Another group got 6-region displays, another 4-region displays, and another 2-region displays. And in the 4, 6, and 8-region displays here, the convex regions are black, but unfortunately in the 2-region, we've got it in white. But we did, of course, have many displays in each condition, 60 of them. Half of the displays, the convex regions, were white and half were black. So we ran this experiment by showing the displays one at a time. We did not have a mask afterwards. We showed for 100 milliseconds in this experiment. And then we asked subjects to tell us, did the black regions or the white regions look like figure? They pressed buttons. And here are the data we got. We found that there was a huge effect of the context of the number of regions in the display. We could replicate the Gestalt Psychologists with their traditional 8-region displays. But if we had just a 2-region display, convexity looks pretty wimpy as an object cue. It's more effective than chance alone. There's some contribution from convexity, but it's only determining where the figure or object lies on approximately 57% of the trials. And you can see a systematic increase with the number of regions. So context matters, but why does context matter? So we call these convexity context effects. And we asked, okay, what's going on here? Is it just the fact that there's a lot of convex objects? Is it that all the convex objects are the same color? Is it that all the concave regions are the same color? With black and white displays, you don't know what's going on. So we wanted to know what were the necessary and sufficient conditions for these effects. We asked, do we get the same effects with multicolored stimuli? There's always a contrast edge between the convex regions and the concave regions. But here, no 2 of the convex regions are the same color, nor are any 2 of the concave regions. Those are our multicolored stimuli. We also ran a condition where all the convex regions were the same color, and the concave regions were different colors, to ask whether the uniformity, the grouping together those convex regions was what caused the context effects. And in the last case, we asked what happens when the convex regions are multicolored, but the concave are uniformly colored. And here, I'm not showing it to you on a medium gray background, but in our experiment, we always showed it on a medium gray background. And here in this display, the convex regions are always darker than the concave, but of course, this was reversed for half of the stimuli the subjects looked at. And in this experiment, we had to go to a probe on-off task. You see this little red spot. It always appeared, subjects were fixating the center border. I've got a cross up at the top there. Subjects were fixating the center border, and a probe appeared on the region either to the right or the left of that central border. And subjects now just had to say whether it was on the object that they saw or off the object they saw at that border. And we know that this technique produces the same results with black and white displays as a direct report about black and white does, so we proceeded to use that here. So now you've all voted for which one you think. You voted internally, I assume, for which one you think is going to replicate our previous effects. And probably just by looking at the screen, you can see which one it will be. But let me show you the results. And this was all between subjects. That is, different subjects got the different region number conditions and the different coloring conditions. Okay, so here are the data again from the black and white displays. And what's shown next are the data from the multicolored displays. So the multicolored displays don't give us our context effects at all. And so that shows us that something like probability summation is not going on here. No effects of context. The next ones are the uniform concave displays. So any of you who are voting for that one, or who could even see it in the demo slides, are right. This is the condition, the uniform concave regions where we replicate the condition with the black and white displays. And when we have the convex regions homogeneously colored, that doesn't matter at all. So what we see here is that when the concave regions are all the same color, when they are homogeneous, we get these context effects. It doesn't matter whether the convex regions are the same color as they are in the black and white, or all different colors as they are in the homogeneous concave case.
And the differences are not statistically significant?
No, those differences are not statistically significant. There is a certain amount of noise. Scott?
In both of those examples, the uniform, they're neutral colors. They're unsaturated. So the 4 concaves are gray, the 4 convex. And was that necessary for this result?
We had, So black and white are the highest contrast you can get against a medium gray background. So if we're going away from black and white, we had to have lower contrast. And so
what I know is that you've got colored, so you've got partially saturated colors for the and the third one, the uniconcave. You have partially saturated colors for the convex, but you have grays for the concave.
Oh, no, that's not necessary. Just the uniformity is necessary. In this first experiment, that's what we used because we're trying to match luminance levels, and that was a little easier. But my student, Beth Salvaggio, has asked whether a different color works on the uniform region, whatever it is, and the answer is yes.
When you flash something, or you have a red-green color that's bright, do you take into account an after image? Because someone may blink, or when you flash it and shut it off.
We do here. That's an interesting question because here we did not mask immediately afterwards, and putting a mask up removes that after image. I'm going to show you an experiment in a little bit where we mask immediately afterwards, and we think subjects were using that duration of time, that they still had the image available to them. Now, whether it was an after image on the screen, which we weren't likely to see, or whether it was simply what's called an icon in the brain, where there isn't another image that is processed immediately afterwards and wipes out accessibility to that image, isn't clear. But it does turn out that accessibility to that image is important. I'll come back to that very shortly.
That might be a clue to the other image.
It might be a clue.
If the after image of a different color might be a clue to what the other image was.
I don't think so. But when I show you the masking studies, you can let me know if you think it still is possible. Okay, so the two conditions where we did not get the results were the conditions where the concave regions were heterogeneous. So what's going on?
So is that consistent with 50%, those numbers?
They're always greater than chance, so they're always a little greater than chance choices. So chance line is 50%, and I don't know why this line is darker. It isn't on your screen. They're all greater than chance. So 57, these all vary between 57 and 60 here. Yeah, it's significantly greater than chance, but it's not much. Okay, so these context effects are found only when there's a homogeneous concave, only when the homogeneous regions are concave. So you might say, well, maybe homogeneity of those alternating regions is just a ground cue. And so maybe you don't need the convex regions at all. To ask that question, we ran an experiment using straight edge borders that didn't have any objectness about them. And what we found here using the same paradigm was, no, we don't get any context effects here. So this was our 8-region condition where if there are context effects, subjects should be seen. The multicolored regions as figure a large percentage of the time, but they're not. They're still at chance. And here there's obviously no difference from chance. So the uniformity of alternating regions alone is not a background cue, and I imagine most of you would have a hard time seeing those multicolored regions standing out. This is just a stripe pattern. That's all it is to your perceptual system. So homogeneity of alternating regions alone is not enough to give you the context effects. But we also know that convexity alone is not enough to give you the context effects. This was one of those conditions that was just hovering right around 57 or 60%. No context effects there. So object cues alone are not enough to give you this context effect. So Dan Goldreich and I argued that the visual system is trying to decide, am I looking at a two-dimensional display, a flat pattern, or am I looking at a depiction of a three-dimensional scene? And it is what's necessary for the 3D scene interpretation is a background cue in conjunction with an object cue. So the background cue is uniformity. of the potential background region. And the object Q in these experiments that I've been showing you here is convexity. And the two of them are operating together. One of them alone is not sufficient to give the context effects. Okay. So how does homogeneity serve as a background cue? What might be going on in terms of what subjects have learned from their experience in the world? So here's one of the displays that has a homogeneous set of concave regions. And we argue that the percept of the homogeneous regions as the ground is quite common, and that the evidence that those homogeneous regions are actually forming a surface behind the objects is accumulating as the number of homogeneous regions increases. So if I give you a display with only 2 homogeneous concave regions, well, there's some evidence for a background cue, but not very much. If I give you more, there's more evidence for that background cue. And if I give you more still, there's even more evidence. And by now, in our experiments, we have subjects up at 90% reports. Why are more and more of these homogeneous regions evidence that the concave region is the background as opposed to the foreground? Well, because it would be very unlikely for multicolored regions to be a background under conditions like we've shown it to you here. It's very unlikely that there would be objects placed in a scene in front of a background. Now, these objects are independent of the background, placed in a scene in front of a background just so that they always occlude the place on the background where the background changes color. So a given object might do that by chance alone. But the more objects you have that seem to be doing that, the less likely the visual system is to accept this interpretation. And so this is an accident of the observer's viewpoint that the observer would ever see multiple independent objects in front of a ground and cutting off that ground only just where it changes color. So I'm going to just occlude the top of the display there to give you a sense that, this is a rendition of what the brain would have to accept as a possibility if it accepted the interpretation that those uniform regions were in front. There's a lot of evidence that the visual system will reject all sorts of accidental interpretations. Accidents of viewing are down-regulated in competitions by the brain. So on this view, when we show people black and white displays, then you've got a whole lot of competition going on. Because, well, the black regions could be objects because they're convex, but they're also all uniformly colored. So they could be a background to the white regions. And the white regions could be a background to the black regions, but they also could be objects. And so it could be that there's a lot of competition going on in these displays, even though subjects report 90% of the time in these 8-region versions that the black regions are figure. And we think that's probably because the bias for convex objects is stronger than the bias for concave objects. It's not a huge bias, but it's a bias in the visual system. But nonetheless, it might be the case that the two interpretations are competing. And this is what I want to show you pictorially here and then tell you about in 2 experiments. So here are the 2 possible interpretations for the black and white displays. Convex objects in front of a white ground in front of a background, or concave objects in front of a background. So what we're going to ask is, do the 2 interpretations for the convex region compete? The convex region being the object versus being the ground. Even though subjects report seeing the convex regions as the object on 90% of the trials, maybe there's competition going on before visual object perception happens. You can also ask whether the 2 interpretations for the concave regions compete. So are the concave regions figures or are they grounds? So is there a lot of competition going on? Now note, if the ground interpretation is competing with the figure interpretation, well, that means that we have scene-wide competition going on. It also means we have influences from high levels in the visual system interacting with processes that might be going on lower. Why do I say that? I say that because as we go up through the visual system, the portion of the visual field that the neurons respond to gets larger and larger, incrementally larger and larger. And so neurons in the brain that are responding to a whole surface, or the potential that something be seen as a whole surface, have to be higher in the visual system than neurons in the brain that are responding to a single border. Okay, so to ask about competition, we asked whether or not it takes time for these context effects to emerge. And here's where I come back to the question of whether we had a mask or not after our display. In some other experiments that I've done, I've demonstrated with my collaborators that when the visual system must resolve competition, heavy competition before a decision it makes a decision about where objects are, that takes a little bit more time than when it doesn't have to resolve heavy competition. So what we're going to do now is explore the unfolding, how long it takes for these context effects to be observed. So for this, we used only 2-region and 8-region displays. And we use this probe on-off task. I'm going to move to a color experiment next, so we need the probe on-off task. We presented our display for 100 milliseconds. We then manipulated the duration of a blank screen, the interstimulus interval, that's ISI, between the first stimulus and our mask that will obliterate the after image and the low-level access to that picture. And so what I'm going to talk about is the stimulus onset asynchrony, SOA, between the onset of the figure ground display and the onset of the mask. So we had 100, that is, the mask came up immediately after that display, 150, 200, 300, or 400. And if there's competition going on, we're going to expect to see that it takes time to observe our context effects. And that's indeed what we found. If the mask came on immediately after the black and white displays, there was no statistical difference between how likely subjects were to see the convex regions as figure in 2-region displays and 8-region displays. If there was a 150 millisecond SOA, so we waited 50 milliseconds after the display went off to put the mask up there, we're beginning to see the convexity context effects emerge, but they're not statistically significant yet. They're fully statistically significant at a 200 millisecond stimulus onset asynchrony. Sorry, these numbers are shifted a little compared to where they should be. This is 200. And then we also asked, well, does it remain if we go out to 300 and 400 milliseconds? We see that the effect has asymptoted by 200 milliseconds. So it looks like maybe there's competition going on because we're not seeing the context effects emerge for the 8-region displays right away. It takes time for them to unfold. But we're making an inference here because we haven't yet tested to see whether there really is competition going on. So to ask whether or not there really is competition going on, we use some displays where we remove the competition for the convex regions. So here the convex regions are multicolored. They're not going to be likely to be seen as the background for the reasons I described before. And I'll show you again in the next slide, or at the bottom of this slide. Here we go. There is no competition for the convex regions between the interpretation that they're figure and the interpretation that they're ground, or at least there's minimal competition. For the reasons I was talking about before, the visual system is going to reject the interpretation that these multicolored regions here are actually little windows onto a multicolored background because it would require accepting an accident of viewing. So we're going to remove the competition for the convex regions. There's still going to be some competition for the concave regions. They could be figures or they could be grounds because they are uniformly colored. So here we used only 2 SOAs, the shorter ones where we did not get context effects with black and white displays. And we ran the experiment the same way we did before. And we're going to predict now that if we didn't see the context effects in the short displays that were masked very shortly after they went off, because the competition had not yet been resolved, that we will see the context effects now because we're using displays that lack the competition. And indeed, that's what we found. So when the 100 millisecond exposure is masked immediately afterwards, when we remove the competition for object status for the convex regions, we see those convexity context effects evident in the briefest exposure we've used so far. Now, we used 100 milliseconds because that's what we had used in the first experiments that I told you about. Now, Beth Salvaggio, my collaborator, is asking, well, how long does it really take? So if I use shorter and shorter exposure durations and mask immediately afterwards, how early in time can I see the context effects when we're using these uniform concave displays? We don't know that answer to that yet. So, let's see. This pair of experiments, we think, confirms the hypothesis that there's a whole lot of competition going on between the different interpretations that might be fit to these displays. In the black and white displays, where both the convex and the concave regions are homogeneous, the brain is trying out a number of organizations before it determines what regions are figure. To you, your percept seems instantaneous. When you look at the display, you see as figure whatever you see as figure. But nonetheless, the visual system is resolving competitions. It's accessing all sorts of possibilities for the scene. And then one of those possibilities dominates. That competition resolution takes time. And so the moral of this story is that even if everyone agrees on what they see in a percept, that doesn't mean that as far as the brain is concerned, that is an unambiguous stimulus. In perception research, we've long called things unambiguous if everyone sees the same thing. But the argument we're making is that, no, there's a lot of ambiguity the visual system is dealing with in this first pass of processing. It's accessing possibilities for what's out there, both in terms of what the objects are, what their semantics are, what the scene-wide organization demands, and it is resolving competition between interpretations at a single level and across all levels. I don't think I have to go through this again. Oh, well, someone can ask me about that if they want to. So we think that we have good evidence in these and other experiments that we've done for this fast initial feed-forward processing pass that accesses object structure and semantics, does scene-wide processing, and also that the proto-objects that might be seen compete for perception. Those that win the competition are perceived. Those that lose the competition are not perceived. And we do have some brain imaging research that backs up what I've told you about today. I want to show you the students and colleagues who have collaborated with me on this. Brad Gibson collaborated with me as a grad student on the earliest studies I told you about from the 90s. He's now an associate professor at Notre Dame. Jay, Laura, and Drew collaborated on the past experience and semantic experiments. They're current students in my lab. Beth Salvaggio is a current student in my lab who collaborated with me on the context effects experiment. And Dan Goldreich is a collaborator at McMaster University with whom I've worked up a Bayesian model of the context effects. So I want to thank the National Science Foundation and you for listening.